G'day, Professor Joseph Drew. As those of you who watch my channel avidly know, I was recently in Japan because I'm adjunct professor over at Tokyo Metropolitan University. And it occurred to me that we can both learn a lot from one another. In this video, I'll give you some really important information, and I think you'll be surprised at what you find. So there's two tasks here: what we can learn from the Japanese, which is an awful lot, and what Japan can learn from Australia. And that's the thing that will truly stun and amaze you. And I'm lucky in my position. I get to talk to senior executives or local governments in Japan, Japanese scholars, and senior bureaucrats in the Japanese national government. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is how broad local government in Japan is compared to Australia. So they do primary schooling, they do welfare, they do hospitals, a lot broader scope than local government in Australia. Indeed, local government in Australia probably has one of the most narrow remits in the world. That's actually holding Australia back. It holds Australia back in terms of efficiency. Wallace Oates proved many decades ago that decentralised government was a more efficient way of delivering services. The fact that our local government does very little, has a very small scope, also holds the nation back in terms of reconciling the very different tastes of a multicultural community. So we could learn a lot from the Japanese there. We could learn a lot because they have horizontal tax equity, something that we do not have in Australia. So it doesn't matter where you live in Japan, you pay the same rate of local government tax. In Australia, what we typically find is people in rural areas, they pay as revenue effort, income divided by the amount of taxes and fees they pay the local government. Rural people typically pay 4 times more tax than city people in Australia. It's completely inequitable. It's one very important explanation for why we have vast tracts of Australia where no one lives. Come to rural Australia, you get to pay 4 times more tax, and you get the third world, much lower quality version of public services. It's not exactly an attractive proposition. The third thing we can learn from local government in Japan is that they have a robust system of intergovernmental grants. In fact, I met the team, very large team, of people who do the calculations for their grants. And yes, unlike Australia, unlike most states in Australia, they actually do robust, proper, grown-up empirical calculations to guide their grant allocations. Most of the states in Australia would be better termed as guess and giggle. There's no empirical evidence behind the allocations at all. And yes, once again, this explains why rural local government lags its city cousins by such a large margin in Australia, because we have guess and giggle grant allocations, whereas the Japanese actually have proper, robust, grown-up, sophisticated empirical allocations for their grants. The fourth thing that the Japanese have that we don't have is no forced amalgamations. They did have indeed a huge program of amalgamations. Anything else in the world pales to their program back at the end of the Great Heisei era. And they do use strong incentives to get their local governments to amalgamate. And some of the incentives you could term, they're really wringing their arm and more or less forcing them into a corner. But at the end of the day, it is their choice, because Japan considers their local government units as democratic systems of government, and they believe that in a democracy you can't force and compel people to do things. You need to give them a choice based on evidence. So that's something we could learn a lot from in Australia also. And the most interesting thing for me on this particular trip, because I've long championed something like this, is the fact that the Japanese national government runs an executive school for their local government executives. They actually run a school where they teach them theory and teach them empirical techniques, teach them about local government sustainability and the like, because local government is a huge, complex and extremely important part of their economy, as it is with ours, and it's important that the people running local government have the requisite skills and knowledge to do so. I've long been an advocate of either compulsory or strongly encourage specific local government qualifications for our executives and our councillors to help them help their communities thrive. Some universities in the past did have qualifications, but they lacked rigour, and those universities have basically vacated the space now. So if universities aren't going to fill the space, well then, as the Japanese government's done, perhaps it's up to our state or national governments to fill the void. Now, what can the Japanese learn from us? Well, they're scholars and they're most senior bureaucrats. I was speaking at the very highest level of seniority, have learnt a lot from Australia, and in particular from New South Wales. They've learnt what not to do. We in Australia are the lesson, basically for the whole world, of how not to do amalgamations. We based our amalgamations on commercial consultant, giggle and guesswork, and that ended up very tragically for the communities with huge rate increases in the order of 50–60% in councils that went into administration because they ran out of money in their general account, in an increase in local government expenditure, or an average of 11%. And there's lots of videos on my site detailing the sophisticated evidence that proves this beyond a shadow of a doubt. And indeed, the Japanese are very interested in our disaster and have asked me to go back there next year to conduct a workshop which will be intended by scholars and senior executives on how we ever got ourselves in this mess. It's quite embarrassing for me as a scholar when I go overseas. Australia is known for doing amalgamations very poorly, and we're known for de-amalgamations. We are the de-amalgamation capital of the world because we tend to royally stuff up our amalgamations. In fact, I was speaking to a colleague in Portugal the other day, and he's just going, that's insane. A lot of the amalgamations you did last time, the land area of the local governments was much larger than entire countries in Europe, and that is true. And this is why our amalgamations end up with inefficiencies, higher costs, and ultimately councils going broke. So sad to say, what the Japanese can learn from us is what not to do. So there's a lot of value in learning from overseas, and there's a lot for overseas people to learn from us. And these trips that academics do certainly are not junkets. I work when I'm overseas 6 a.m. to typically midnight because the Japanese do huge long hours, and I build lots of important networks and convey and receive lots of important information which gives us all ideas on how to do things better for our communities. And that's what local government is ultimately all about, people. And anytime we forget that, and we've forgotten that many times in Australia in the past, particularly during amalgamations, anytime we forget that local government's about people, we lose the whole point of everything and we fail our communities. Look, if you enjoyed this video, please send it around elsewhere, give it the thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much. Goodbye.